Now, we are live. All right, we are live. And we're going to continue our discussion from last Friday. This is all we're going to do this afternoon, unless the committee would like to talk about deal bills. But I'm putting that off until tomorrow when Senator Brock is here. We can continue that discussion, but we have two witnesses who signed up to be here last Friday, and we got tied up on the floor with, I don't even remember which bill, but we got down about this time last Friday and didn't get through all our witnesses. So we have Karen Lafayette.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Senate.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be back here. I'm Karen Lafayette, and I'm representing the Vermont Low Income Advocacy Council. And that's a statewide advocacy group that has been representing the interests of low and moderate income Vermonters for 53 years in the state. I am a resident of the city of Burlington and have also served as the city's lobbyist for many years in the 2000s. I was a member of this body in this committee. Well, this Ways and Means testimony. So a member of the Ways and Means Committee when we passed Act 60, the Educational Opportunity Act. That was some 30 years ago. There have been a number of adjustments over the years, and it seems like every 2 or 3 decades, education financing becomes a very pressing affordability issue for Vermonters, with trying to balance the increased costs, provide quality education, and create a fair measure of taxation. But we find ourselves here again. I wanted to speak to both the reasons for keeping and updating the income sensitivity and the move to the property tax exemption in H454 as passed by the House. I just like to keep 3 things in mind. I'm not speaking to any of the other pieces of the educational reform, although there's a lot to be discussed. Updating income sensitivity is the most equitable way to achieve property tax relief. Property values do not necessarily, and in many cases, represent the ability to pay. An arbitrary tax on any of the systems you put in place generally make it inequitable for those that are least able to pay, especially those who live in homes that have risen in value over the past years. I think it's important to remember the key components of Act 60 to provide equal educational opportunities to all Vermont children, and that every school district would have the same ability to raise the same amount of money with the same rate taxation, no matter what the property wealth of your town was. Everyone knows how disparate that was before we passed Act 60. There were towns that with 1 cent on property tax could raise $35, and there were towns that could raise $1,900 with 1 cent on the property tax, and that made it very, very unequal for taxpayers and for children. Vermonters were also able to pay their education property tax based on their income and not the value of their property. Equal spending per pupil meant equal tax burdens, and that may or may not reflect their ability to pay. But even before Act 60, for 55 years, Vermont provided income sensitivity for both municipal and education taxes for seniors and for low-income households. The break on municipal taxes continued under Act 60 as well, generally called the super circuit breaker, for those under 47,000 of household income, which has remained the same for decades. That has not been updated. As complicated as it has been to deliver income sensitivity through the different town tax rates and spending and household income and lag years, providing rebates for property tax payments to the towns. The vast majority of Vermonters were able to pay based on their ability to pay without going straight to an income tax to pay for education, which we have not done. And it seems that there's no interest in doing that this time around as well. Across the state, equal per pupil expenditures met equal tax burdens, the same tax rate against your property value, or the same income tax rate. It allowed persons to pay for their education taxes based on their ability to pay. It also allowed for households to pay on income or the value of their property for high income earners. That was less expensive, and they were allowed to pay on the value of their house. Income sensitivity has not been updated. Although we have increased income eligibility over the years from $75,000 when it started to qualify for income sensitivity, we have not updated the income sensitivity components of Act 60 for moderate and low income households to reflect the soaring increases in the value of residential real estate or increased costs in education and municipal funding. In fact, income sensitivity has been diminished over the years with a reduced cap on the amount of the house value that is income sensitized and artificial caps on the property tax credits that have not kept up with rising values and income limits. The effect on certain groups of people, especially lower income persons living in higher value properties over 400K, through no choice of their own, is that though their town's income tax rate for financing might be 2.5% of their income and 3% of their income for municipal taxes, they are often paying double that percentage for each for their property taxes because of the restrictions and the caps in the amount of the credit allowed and the cap on the value of the house that is income sensitized. As an example, property taxes have soared, reappraisal, and COVID. After Burlington's reappraisal and market demands during COVID pandemic, many homeowners saw a doubling of their property tax values. Of the 35 houses on my street, only 2 homes remained under $500,000. Although the tax rate was adjusted over the years to reflect the CLA before the city reappraised, the reappraisal shifted values from commercial properties to residential properties and from one neighborhood to another. So the increased value, coupled with the income sensitivity restrictions only on the first 400,000, brought substantial tax increases to many homeowners. A typical home in the South End where I live, and I only speak to my own situation because I know it mirrors and reflects so many towns that have seen property values this high. That increased the value from under 300,000 of property value to over 500,000. The property taxes on a house of that value, about $525,000 in the city of Burlington, are $13,000. That's $8,500 for education and $4,500 for municipal taxes. There's an overall cap of $8,000 on the amount of property tax you can get, $2,400 for municipal, if you qualify for super circuit breaker, and $5,600 for your education tax. So that means that you can do the math. A person with $60,000 of household income, the total taxes would be 11% of income, no break on the municipal taxes. With a $40,000 income qualifying for the municipal credit as well, that would be paying 11.6 of their income, because once they hit no matter what they qualify for, once they hit that $8,000 cap on the amount of the credit, they don't get any more relief than that. Burlington's not just Burlington is reflective of the towns in Chittenden County, but also many other parts of the state where property values have increased. Under the current income sensitivity, the tax burdens of persons with identical income and identical per pupil education spending no longer have equal tax burdens. Now there has been some suggestions, and maybe here's some stuff from Austin a little later on, that seniors living in those homes that have increased value, and are underutilizing their homes, should seek other housings, downsize. Even if they wish to move out of a neighborhood that they maybe have, are comfortable with, know their neighbors, and want to stay, there are often no affordable options in that town. Maybe they can get a condo or a small ranch house, if they can find it, but the cost to purchase those in that town or that neighborhood will likely use up all of the proceeds from their sale. And they may still have a mortgage to pay. And then they are still paying high property taxes and or HOA fees, that come close to a mortgage payment, and no additional funds to supplement their fixed income. Many seniors, for those reasons, many seniors are aging in place in a home that has increased in value and may need work to accommodate their aging in place. Many Vermonters who live in houses over 400,000 K do not have other substantial assets, maybe some savings, maybe an IRA. Many still have mortgages, but in order to access their main asset, which is their house, they are probably going to have to do something like a reverse mortgage or borrow from family to access to be able to access their equity in their home, and then use the proceeds necessary to make necessary repairs, pay their property taxes, and supplement their Social Security income to pay living expenses. I'm sure there are some retired seniors who have lower incomes on paper, but have substantial assets. But so far, this state has not done that asset determination. And in order to prevent those persons with lower incomes but substantial assets from benefiting from property tax reduction, we have placed restrictions on income sensitivity and caps on credits that end up penalizing those who are with the least ability to pay. This means that moderate and low income Vermonters are paying a higher percentage of their income than those with the most ability to pay. According to Public Assets, the cost to update income sensitivity and provide equity property tax relief is about 50 to 60 million. Unfortunately, H54 as passed by the House moves away from income sensitivity. And that's one of the key components of Act 60, equal tax burdens. The initial proposal from the administration and the final version passed by the House both move away from income sensitivity and base your property taxes on the value of your property with a homestead exemption, exempting a certain portion value of that taxation. As I understand it, the reason for moving to property tax value exemption is because it is easier to administer. It is perceived as more transparent to people in understanding their tax liability when making spending decisions. I'm not so convinced that that's the case. I know many people in the city of Burlington, when their taxes doubled, when their property value doubled, even though if they understood their income sensitivity, they understood that their taxes were going to go up, and they voted against school budgets for the first time that they ever did. And I don't think that's the way we want to achieve property tax. Property tax reduction is by voting down school budgets. There's got to be a better way. The first proposal from the administration that utilized the exemption had an initial exemption of 50 to 60% of house value, but with a maximum cap of 200K. All of the charts presented by them at the time showed that the exemption at those levels with a $200,000 cap would increase the taxes of moderate and lower income people across the board. For lower income people living in houses with values of 400K or more would see increases, and this is increases over what they're paying now, upwards of $1,900. Using the same value home as in the previous example, $525,000. With the current tax rates, a person earning $60,000 of household income would be paying 14% of their income. And those at the $40,000 level qualifying for a municipal tax credit would be paying upwards of $16,000, 16% of their income. And I know that's a lot of numbers, and I did the math, and I know you've seen plenty of charts, but that's kind of what it comes down to. Now, the House passed version of 454 did move to the property tax exemption system for education taxes as well, but made it more reflective of ability to pay by creating income sensitivity brackets with declining exemptions with amounts ranging from a high of 95% to a low of 10%. At the maximum level of income that could benefit. It also puts no maximum cap on the amount of the exemption one can receive, which is the only way to make a regressive tax somewhat based on ability to pay. The cost of the property tax exemption with a maximum cap of $200,000 costs the same as current income sensitivity. So it saves no money and increases the taxes for those with the least ability to pay, especially for those in areas of the state where residential values are high. Property values do not necessarily reflect ability to pay, and caps on the amount of the exemption do not recognize the varying property values from town to town and regions. Even with maximum exemptions of 300 to 400K, with a more significant levels of exemption based on income, you are still setting up a situation where two households of equal income spending the exact same amount per pupil will be paying very different amounts in property taxes. We would still be providing equal access to education financing for students, but no longer providing taxpayer equity. Additionally, for the lowest income Vermonters, under 47K of household income, they would no longer have the choice to pay their property taxes based on their income for education. And we have had that system for 50 years for both municipal and education taxes. Even under Act 60, those with higher incomes, again, could choose to pay based on their income or on the value of their property. Moving to a property tax exemption for education takes away the choice for those least able to pay. Both proposals keep the municipal tax credit for those under $47,000 household income. But with the existing cap of $2,400 on the amount of the credit. Persons in high municipal tax towns in higher value homes are paying well more than 3% of their income that is listed as the intent in the legislation. Caps are the enemy of equity. In final comments, if you are moving in the direction of switching to property value exemption for education financing, please consider the House passed version with the more sensitive income brackets and more significant exemption amounts and with no caps. The House passed version apparently costs about $45 million, but it does provide better property tax relief, even if not solely based on ability to pay. Each time you implement a maximum cap on the amount of the exemption to save money or other arbitrary caps, the persons paying for that savings are the lowest income Vermonters in higher value properties, and you don't capture any more from the higher income earners. I don't know all of the other pieces of the education reform legislation, how it will, if it's expected to, reduce costs or property tax rates. But right now, evidenced by the 77 million, we're sinking into bringing property rates down. It seems that to provide ongoing relief to taxpayers, we need to increase our efforts in addressing property tax relief. And I hope that we can make that decision as equitable as possible. Thank you.
Questions?
Madam Chair, thank you. That was really interesting. Have you submitted it so we have it in writing so I can?
I don't know, I'll clean it up and I'll send it.
That would be great. I want to understand so the House Pass version does include both a sort of combination of income sensitivity as it applies to a property tax exemption, more so than that as introduced version.
Correct.
Scales it up. And so can you help me understand, you're adamant that we not have caps. And I'm trying to figure out, I mean, if you have a, $1 million home and your income, reported income is still low, isn't there some argument to be made that you have this $1 million home and maybe you should only get an exemption on part of the value of the home? Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Well, as I said, that's a decision that kind of should be made before we're providing property tax. We do not determine assets right now.
Yeah.
So a person who's a retired person, maybe they didn't have a big work life, so their social security income is maybe $60,000-$70,000, or well, probably less than that. Maybe they have a lot of assets. I can't believe that they don't have some kind of interest income or something like that they should be divulging. But in order to prevent those people, which probably is a situation that doesn't occur that often, I don't think you have many people who are truly living in $1 million homes because they wouldn't have been able to pay any of their property taxes, for the past number of years. In order to prevent those persons from receiving a benefit because they live in $1 million house, we're penalizing those with the least ability to pay. I just don't think that seems particularly fair. The other thing is that when the chair of Ways and Means was in here the other day, she seemed to indicate, and I don't know if I understood this, what she was saying, but she seemed to indicate that there actually was not much cost over a $500,000 exemption, tending to make me believe that there are not those, it doesn't cost more because there are not those people receiving the benefit, who live in $1 million houses. I know that the public assets in terms of income sensitivity were suggesting to go up to $1 million of house to income sensitized, and there's a different system, but that seems to be the level that people are using. I know that they looked at different caps and they might be considering those, and I just would urge there to be some kind of review, or at least try to determine what that level is. I would think it would be somewhere $500,000, $600,000 at the very least, if you are going to do a cap. Just because, I mean, you may well know where the property values have soared in the last few years.
Yeah.
I'm also advocating that cap be somewhat adjusted for area, median price of homes, because Chittenden County houses sell at different, for the same square footage, sell at a much different amount than Essex County or elsewhere. And so I feel like that cap should be relatively adjusted to what we see in the real estate market. That
would be another way to do it. But also I would urge to keep those income levels because they're much more significant than just giving a flat 50% reduction in the amount. And then they step down and booked, I guess, $115,000 of household income.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll send that along.
Good afternoon. For the record, Austin Davis, Director of Government Affairs with the Lake Champlain Chamber. Thank you all for your time and continually rescheduling me. I'll try to keep my remarks pretty brief because I know by evidence by the fact that I've been rescheduled so many times, and I know your time is short, and I know you've got talked at a lot and sat for a long time on the floor today. The Lake Champlain Chamber is a 114-year-old organization that not just like a 5-year time horizon, but we're considering all of these conversations around our education system, around our housing stock, and other things in the context of the next half century, the workforce of tomorrow, et cetera. We convened a working group on issues of education finance and education reform this summer. And that's guiding much of the testimony today. And there's a lot we can talk about. However, a lot of the work's being done down the hallway, obviously. And I'm going to limit conversation today to just around rate classification, the property tax credit, the homestead exemptionship, and some concerns around supplemental district spending. I did just want to point out at the start of this, because I've been in this committee since you did it, that underlying a lot of this conversation is the elephant in the room, which is just housing and groundless growth. And the needs of our education system are best suited if we can grow our groundless in the state and have adequate housing. And so I want to thank you as a committee for the work you did on the CHIP program, as it's aimed to build the homes that we need for our educators and our students, and grow our grand lists that support the education system.
Austin, are you going to have this in writing so we don't have it on our website?
I don't have anything writing. I can clean up notes and send it to you.
If you have recommendations from the summer study, it would be helpful to have those in writing.
So around rate classifications, which was not something we talked about in our summer working group, because I was kind of new to us this session. I think we've heard from the tax department kind of loud and clear that this proposal seems ready for prime time, and it comes down to 3 issues: the definition, the identification, and mixed use. We don't have the infrastructure in place to actually kind of create these rate classifications. Primarily what is used in the other municipalities that was really modeled after originally is kind of robust planning and zoning that confines parcels to specific uses and classification that then translates through to ultimate taxation. We don't have that level of planning and zoning here in the state of Vermont. That's not coherent and top down. I think the other thing that didn't really hear as much from the tax department is around tax avoidance, which I think is not something that's necessarily adequately dealt with in the House bill sent to you. So we have some extreme concerns around adding just additional levers that can create some political paralysis around the rate classification. When it comes to potentially having to set 4 different tax rates, plus potentially supplemental district spending yield each year, and the impact this might have on just principles of sound tax policy. Joint fiscal often explains the education fund is kind of like a balloon. So if you're trying to adjust or push on one of these rate classes, it's going to balloon into another. And that can have unintended consequences, taken to an ultimate, the furthest point of that, you could depress one of these rates such that you actually take the most stable revenue source the state has and inject volatility to it. So that's something of concern. And I think we're concerned about having these ongoing conversations about different rate classes year over year that kind of inject volatility for folks who are planning around their tax rates. There's already been volatility. We don't want to see that.
Wait, can I just
Yeah.
clarification there? Are you talking about volatility among the different proposed tax classifications for types of property?
That's right.
So that if, for example, if there were changes in the tax rates for the different kinds of non-homesteads, and they didn't know what it was from year to year, that would be.
That's one half of, that's one half of volatility, certainly, yes. The other thing to think about would be if we say we want to reduce tax rates for one particular rate class, and that has to then get pushed off on the other two or three. Then we end up in a potentially a situation where if we become heavily dependent on one rate class for a lot of our revenue, and then that rate class runs into some kind of headwinds. Now you've kind of disaggregated what was a really stable source of revenue and push yourself to a place where it's less stable. It's stable right now because there's only two rate classes, and within those rate classes, there's a lot of diversity among the payers, and so that would just be a concern. Not in this year or next year, but years down the road, if this is able to play out to its an ultimate ending. Let's say we become very dependent on second homes as a rate class.
Have you seen that in any research you've done in other jurisdictions that have multiple rate classes? I mean, have you seen that kind of volatility?
So what this is modeled after, that the House uses as a starting point is actually the rate classification system of Hawaii.
Yeah,
And again, Hawaii is able to do this because of robust planning and zoning.
I see.
But in the Hawaii context, I'm not sure how that's played out. I think that they've probably built that into their discussion, but and I'm not sure if it's something that they're observing. Nonetheless, I think that'd be something I'd be concerned about, especially when we talk about, for example, the rate class of second homes. Many folks, I'm not saying everybody supported this proposal, but many folks have explained it as kind of a policy lever to also convert more second homes into full-time resident homes. So if that's played out, if that's effective, if it's used effectively towards that end, then you're dependent on the revenue in the beginning years of that policy lever being used. Then all of a sudden you start eroding that, and then you go, oh, well, now we got to push more back onto the residential class, which they might see as a good problem to have, but it's something to just note that you are injecting a little bit of volatility there.
Okay, thanks.
Where was that? Yeah, so I think, in terms of tax avoidance, as we discussed kind of before, it's not necessarily clear if all of the goals of these rate classification systems can be realized. So for example, second homes, if your new classification for second homes is supposed to set to so you can create a higher rate on those, what's to stop a homeowner from transferring that second home to a trust or an LLC that then gets a landlord certificate and then leases back to the second homeowner as a tenant, and what's to say if you fix that workaround, that another one doesn't pop up in its place. If you decide to reduce the tax rate on the non-homestead apartment class, what's to say that the benefit would actually be felt and actually eventually make its way through to the renters, or would it be just more efficacious to further invest in the renter credit program instead? So I think there's just a question of, underlying this whole rate classification system, which has really shaken up our property tax system in this draft. It's really aimed at getting at that second home rate class. And it feels a little bit like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. There's a lot of unintended impacts. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of administrative burden, a we're not sure if it would actually accomplish all of the goals that we want. And so
In none of these bills so far is the second home tax.
on
I
the,
mean, there's we've been asking for more granularity. But that there isn't any increased tax that I know of.
well, the classification system with the 4 classifications, then non-homestead residential would effectively be a second home category or classification. And then the intent that we've heard is that that would be, then at a higher rate, all at equal rates in the legislation as drafted, but then down the road, we'd expect to see the rates be higher.
Isn't the renter credit? I mean, you're not the right person to ask this, probably the tax department a bit, but you just mentioned administrative burden. I mean, the renter credit has an administrative burden too, and it also doesn't sync up with the property tax. Now, it doesn't have to as much because they're not paying property taxes, the landlord is, but I also think that, we would be getting rid of some administrative burden and just replacing it with maybe a different kind of administrative burden. But
I don't know if you'd want to necessarily get rid of a renter credit if creating I guess that's the policy choice.
I guess the bill does not get rid of the rent,
Yeah.
to be fair.
And so you have, you'd be trying to, and again, all the rates are the same for all of these classifications as the bills are drafted.
Non-homestead, at least when we separated the two. Paid in many places are still paying,
Mhm.
are paying now a lower rate than the homestead.
In some locations.
And I would bet at this point, most locations.
Yeah.
So I think, we're just concerned about the transition to this that's kind of more complicated, rate classification structure. That we think we're better served by having homestead and non-homestead or moving to a unified rate. And, have concerns that if there are a myriad of issues that can come out of creating these rate classes, in terms of unintended consequences. And all of this might be just to not actually get a lot of the intended impacts that is coming out of this. So I guess, is there I think what we would suggest would be to, just have the tax department further study this, don't move forward with the language in the bill that creates this new classifications. From testimony I'm observing conversation with the tax department, they seem to think that in the future, they can maybe handle only one more rate classification, though they still don't know how they would handle that just because of issues around, definition, identification, mixed use, preventing tax avoidance, attestation, and, and syncing up, frankly, different fiscal calendars. I think that it's really just not ready for prime time, and we have concerns about moving. I think if folks are looking at getting at second homes, I think, well, no one in this country has actually gotten at it. A better direction to be looking at is one of a surcharge that doesn't require a vast overhaul of the entire property tax system, and probably leans really heavily on municipal partners who can identify more easily those and get more granular. So
Do a surcharge.
yes,
Based on what?
I don't know exactly. I'm saying that I'd rather see a surcharge outside of the property tax system than completely overhauling the property tax system and injecting
Income tax
volatility.
surcharge.
But what?
Income tax surcharge.
Well, I mean, I think that gets,
High income earners.
that's the issue is the second home owner, if they're a second homeowner that lives in the state, they will be filing income tax, but if they're not living in the state, they won't be filing. And that's really where we get the identification. this goes back to the identification part of this. The reason why non-homestead and homestead works is because we have, every year when you file your taxes, you got the homestead declaration. And depending on your tax software, not all of them actually get it right. So make sure to call to the tax department or check with the tax department with my V-Tax, because I learned that the hard way, that certain software does not understand that. But you have that moment in time each year where an individual says, because they're making income in the state, they have to come to you and say, hey, I actually live in the state in my own house. There isn't that for these other things. And so that's where it's really tricky.
Well, the bill doesn't have it going into effect at this point until I think FY30. So I hear you about maybe not ready for prime time now, but that's 5 years, 4 years.
Just creep up. I think.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But there's still, a point being is there's still time to flesh out the details
And I think
and maybe to have a field trip to Hawaii, to find out how they do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that sounds like a rough field trip. And I think that might be a good idea. I don't think legislating in the meantime, though, when we're not even sure if the classification system is the best path forward. Legislating that I think that can be accomplished in a study. I don't want to see a repeat of a clean heat standard where we kind of put it in
Come on,
statute.
that's
and
a
then
red
study
herring.
after.
Come on.
Just trying to warm people up for tomorrow's floors. So, anyway, I'll move on to, homestead exemption. And I think we're thrilled to see that the homestead exemption actually make it into this bill. This is something that we pitched last year, and talked about last year. And we're happy to see it included in the governor's proposal, and that the House, actually sent it over here as well. It's an important transition aimed at, reducing complexity, enhancing transparency, and promoting predictability in property tax relief. I think that's appreciated by all.
By Austin, your Lake Champlain Chamber, City of Burlington, Lake Shore, in one of the areas that has very high and increasing property values. You probably have the youngest population in the state, but you also have a significant number of seniors who have lived in their homes, who, if they're lucky enough to have a 401k, and there was a horrifying statistic that the former treasurer had about the percentage of people in this state that have less than $2,000 in retirement income savings. How do we, not force some of those people out onto the street? That we've got some already being forced out because the rents are gone sky high. The housing values have gone sky high. I happen to have a ski town in my district. I have several actually, but a shed in the backyard is valued at $300,000. How do we reconcile that without even talking about first, second, third homes?
Mm-hmm. So we have 5 reforms that we talked to you folks about last year and did some more work on this summer. And I think it'd be great if we could have the tax department do further work on. But one of them was the homestead exemption effectively. But I think we're also interested in seeing, and what I was going to make as a recommendation for a report from the tax department is around household size adjustments. I think we've done that in the property tax credit, for example, around qualified refugees living in a home. We had a situation in the past that past legislatures addressed, where folks brought somebody else into their home doing the right thing.
Yes.
That income pushed the household income too high for them to actually qualify for income sensitivity. And they ended up worse off. We said we didn't want to do that, so we made that exemption. I think that is something that we should, look at doing for all Vermont taxpayers. If they're,
We're going to force people to take strangers into their homes.
I think what we want to do is we want to reflect income per person under our roof, not just income under our roof. And this, it's not going to force people to take strangers into their homes, but it's going to not penalize people who have dual income households, multi-generational living, and other arrangements. I think this actually gets at a little bit of kind of the conversation that's been had around the property tax credit has been one of primarily about vertical equity. It's a focus on how taxes affect, people from the bottom to the top of the income spectrum. We haven't necessarily had a lot of conversations around the property tax credit in the context of horizontal equity. So whether taxpayers of similar income and property wealth, but different life circumstances, how they're affected. And I think that's actually where a lot of the agitation comes when people look at the income sensitivity program, because they're saying, well, I'm sitting in this house with a mortgage and they're sitting in the same exact house and it's paid off. And because they have, less income than me, they're getting this property tax credit, which is effectively just me pushing it next door.
You took out a second mortgage to do a world tour. And I know people that have done similar things that should have paid off their mortgage. But they've taken mortgages out to pay for their kids' education.
I think that's what you're getting at. There's a lot of life circumstances that we don't have the
And the
ability.
tax code can't do that. But the reason we're doing a lot of this is to reduce the tax burden on people. Because people have non-liquid assets, that is a house that, let's face it, in the last 5 years has in many instances doubled in value. They couldn't buy this house at their peak earning years. That's through no fault of their own. That is supply and demand. We have not provided the supply, especially outside of Chittenden. I've had my name just because it rotates on the senior living apartments that I was the marketing director for years. I have never been called. You made a deposit, you got your name on. When there was a vacancy, they call. The longest standing one gets called first, they wait down. I've never been called. The founder of this agent, of this complex, when he was ready to retire, couldn't get an apartment there. And this is Montpelier. We don't have housing for people. And these are not people of moderate means. There is a means test to get into these places because they need to know you can pay the fees going forward. They don't have nursing homes. Most of them have an assisted living component. We don't have enough of those. Senior apartments, we don't have an option to move out of your family home. So how do we deal with people who have not low incomes? We do have people that are better off paying on their property value than their low incomes, which is one reason nobody's moved to an income tax yet. Because that comes up in every analysis we've looked at. But how, people that have a comfortable income, but a very high house value, and they can't afford paying double-digit property taxes every year, especially when they have limited savings. And I think that's what we're trying to find is an equitable way. We've got a perfect storm. Property tax, the house values, through no fault of anyone that owns houses now, have gone up much faster than people's income. And definitely, if you earned your retirement, your 401k 10, 15 years ago, or 20 in some cases, it isn't pensions for it. If you don't have a pension with a cost of living, and I think only public employees do at this stage. So we've got people in this bind. We've got other people that have potential for growing incomes. We've got people that are low income and are eligible for other, services and earned income tax credits and renter rebate credits and things like that. But it's your middle class people who work in your businesses, who, with a backbone, who now are caught. Their houses have worth way more than they were. Their incomes are comfortable, but not enough to keep absorbing the kinds of tax increases we're seeing. And we're trying to get those tax increases controlled. But what's an equitable way to do that? I can't go sell off the stock the day the market peaks. I can't sell my house off like that unless I have an alternative. And most people don't right now. So I think we're trying to find how do you deal with that equitably, and to say, well, if you've got two people, and Senator Chittenden had one, something about the number of people per square foot in your house, which I think is another version of how many people are in your house. Because we do income, it's household income. We leave off a good portion of your college-age kids working. But if grandma has a trust fund and grandma lives with you, she gets counted because her money is available to pay the property taxes. But that's what we're trying to do. And if you say, well, if there's two of you in there, you're going to pay a higher tax than if you take in two strangers, because not everybody has two bathrooms and not everybody wants to share with a stranger, especially not when you're older and this is your family home. And so that's, I think, what we're struggling with.
Well, for the record, I did not indicate, but I think we should be taking in strangers. So just real quick, the 5 reforms that we looked at kind of looked at to work in concert. So I think household adjustment is important. I think on the other end of what you're mentioning too is that nobody who's purchased a home in the last 7 years can actually make use of the property tax credit. To buy your median home, but for if they have a significant amount of wealth that they put in as a down payment. You'll need to see, a lender will need to see a household income that will disqualify someone for a property tax credit. Property tax credit right now is capped at $115,000 household income. If you're trying to buy a home in the state of Vermont, a lender's going to likely want to see in excess of that. So if you're on the other end of that spectrum, if you're a younger family trying to purchase a home, you have the unique knowledge that by virtue of being eligible to buy that home, you are ineligible for any assistance on the property tax. And I think that's problematic too, because we're really asking a whole generation of younger people to then kind of subsidize people who already own homes or people who have the wealth to purchase a home with a lower mortgage so they can qualify with a smaller amount of income. So I think that there is a tricky situation around wealth here. And that gets to my point around horizontal equity. I mean, I think people know this in their community. So they look around and they see someone who, buys a home or it has a home that's worth a lot of money and they know they're paying less on their property tax. So I think that's what we're trying to get out. So house size is one of the things. A net asset attestation. We brought that to you folks last year. And I think the tax department said, we can't do it. We can't follow up. You go to any state benefit, there is a net asset attestation. On the Child Care Financial Assistance Program, there's a net asset attestation says you do not have an excess of $1 million. You check that, your form goes into the recycling bin right away. I think that that's something we don't have to overthink. It could be a component of that. 1 million might not be the correct thing when we're talking about, folks who own homes and retirement assets, but there's probably a number that a net asset attestation could have. Maine and Minnesota have done interesting work around deferred payment for seniors. And this means that, we could have
We have had testimony on that system. I think it's more than Maine and Minnesota. You basically put a lien on your house until you die. I'm not sure what happens if you end up on Medicaid in a nursing home, which most people do end up on Medicaid in a very short amount of time. And the state puts a lien on your house, but the state also has a lien on your house for your property taxes. The bankers aren't here, but they hate liens. How do we work that out?
So it'd have to be part of a holistic estate planning, and it'd have to be, that the tax department has, first dibs on the equity. But it is something that is working in other states. It is a component as another component of a package of relief that could be helpful. I think we're interested in the idea of also looking at potentially, can consider a downsizing incentive. There are issues around, obviously taking equity and moving to another property might not be necessarily complete the most economical choice, but it makes sense for a whole lot of reasons. Ongoing, maintenance and other components that are associated with homes. If you can allow a proportion of or a proportional credit that what you see with the property tax credit to be taken by a person after vacating a home, provided it's going to a primary resident, then you can make a situation where you can actually help individuals in that transfer, that downside.
The problem is, and I would be a lot less hard about this. The problem is we don't have the homes to downsize to. It's not that everybody is sitting there saying, I'm not moving and you're going to help me with my property taxes, so I don't have to move. There is no little slab ranch house for people starting out to buy and build equity and people trying to downsize. The last time we built them was probably in the 1980s. There's several on the end of my street. I had looked at them. Well, the one I looked at is my retirement home, just sold for $460,000. That's not downsizing. And
I think this is to some extent, we have a critical lack of what I call entry and exit housing. It's it's your first rung on the ladder, and then it's really not a ladder, it's more like a parabolic arc. It's your last rung too. We have a critical lack. I think part of that has been the property tax credit as a market. pressure, that's kept people, it's built this, we built the
I was a
system.
Realtor, so I have never seen the property tax credit even mentioned. The first time they think about it is when you come to closing and you've got to pay the owner, the buyer has to pay the seller for a prorated property tax credit. That's usually the first time that issue comes up, other than the basic disclosure.
It's,
And if they qualify, you will have to prorate it.
what it is taking effect on is the market pressures that individuals are feeling while living in the house. And there's interesting research, on this out of, that looks at the California and Texas housing markets and the impact of property taxes on turnover and on, how individuals plan estates. So I can provide the committee with that research if you'd like. But that it's not necessarily a conversation around sale, it's a conversation around ongoing and like inhabitation, and then the individual,
They
not.
come to the same conclusion, because those are two very different housing markets. California is very expensive and housing is very scarce. Texas, I'm told by local businesses, the major city their employees choose to move to. Housing is abundant and affordable. So
And that's why the researchers were using it to compare and contrast, and also there's been a lot of migration from one to the other.
if you could send that to us, that would be helpful.
So the last, policy lever on this, on the property tax credit is, regional adjustments. To your point, some areas have more expensive housing than others. And if you look at just the basic need budget that the state publishes each year, you can see regional differences between rural and urban from the range of 13 to 35%, differences in cost of living. With the renter credit, to circle back to that, the renter credit actually is on a county by county basis, what is assessed as the credit. The rental credit also is assessed at income per person in the rental unit. I actually think moving the entire property tax credit system to be closer to the rental credit system would resolve a lot of these horizontal equity considerations. And we put considerable work back in 2020, and the Lake Chamber was part of that, into making the renter credit, cover all these things. And I think everybody from us to the low income advocates, left, right, and center, all kind of agree that the renter credit got to a good place. So that's another component on this is just regional adjustments by county, or
To the existing credit or to a deduction?
or to the deduction either. There's an interesting world out there of just how folks handle this. I think the tax department might have talked to you about how Massachusetts does it. They actually have an exemption on up to 30% of the median value of the homes in that county in Massachusetts. Like, that's just an interesting way to look at it, like you're kind of looked at in a category of all of your county peers, and then you're looking at what the median value is, and then you're saying, okay, well, up to 30% of that, you don't get taxed on. And so there's a lot of ways to go about this. But I think regionalization could be an important next step in whatever direction, be it keeping with property tax credit or moving to a homestead exemption. That kind of concludes comments that I had on the homestead exemption. Is there anything else, questions wise on
Not seeing any, and I am losing
that?
steam. Senator Chittenden is, I assume, listening, and he's driving, so I hope he's not looking. And he does this other thing called a job. But he said he would be listening on Zoom, so. But I don't think, I can't see him, so I can't count him as a quorum. And you're making motions like you need to leave.
No, not till 5, but
Okay.
I had a quick comment slash question. Because Austin, thank you, by the way, this was really interesting, but you started off talking about complexity and the different levels or categories of the tax that are potentially being proposed would really add complexity to the system, but it seems like a lot of your proposals would also add complexity potentially.
I think, these are complexities around the like end payer side of things for like a specific benefit program. And I think that these are all things that are kind of trying to get at lessening tax burden on individuals who are kind of disproportionately hit. And I think some of these aren't gonna be that difficult, like, we already, the net asset attestation, it's a checkbox on a form that means do not pass go, do not collect $200, the household size adjustment, I think that's pretty common in a lot of places, like, if you have dependents, you different tax liability than if you don't have dependents. Same thing should probably carry through, like saying that, a person who has a 3-bedroom home with 2 children is very different than a person with a 3-bedroom home by themselves. And it might be worthwhile to reflect that in our tax code. And then, I think the deferral for payment of seniors, yes, that adds complexity, but I think it's a goal of everyone's and it's not very easy. Unless we really want to bring down the tax rate by a dramatic amount in the state, then, we're not gonna. The other thing is, the whole property tax credit program injects a ton of complexity and you're not gonna unwind that complexity. So it's like, we got to go further down the complexity rabbit hole, to make it today.
I should take a look at all those credits. You should take a close look at those. I would like to.
The ones that I described,
No, just all the ones that are currently on the books.
Just across the board tax.
Across the
Yeah.
board.
So moving, and I know I'm losing folks, so I'll try to be really quick on here. I think
You gotta write it all down for us.
I commend, the House for advancing the foundation formula. I think there's a lot of positive benefits we see in our state education system around equity, delivery, transparency, et cetera. I think that, it's important to include a version of supplemental district spending. I think if you even look back at Brigham, there is a, conversation in that decision around just local control, allowing folks to continue to keep control. And, I don't think you want to completely lose local control on the transition to a foundation formula. And that's to a extent what would happen if there was no supplemental district spending. We do think that the House's version of how to pay for supplemental district spending potentially, perpetuates some of the problems of the current system. And, I think we're more aligned with the state guarantee. I think that what Senator Chittenden's proposed is kind of an interesting middle ground. Still trying to understand it a little bit more around how to raise and pay for supplemental district spending. But the crux of it is, we kind of don't want to have a system that is effectively penalizing how high value grand list districts, and not incentivizing grand list growth and lower value grand list districts. I think that's kind of, if I were to try to at this hour of the afternoon summarize it as coherently and quickly as possible, that would be what we're looking at. And I think that is something that we like in the state guarantee system, is that it's, basing it off of median, bringing people up to median, but not necessarily penalizing folks who are above median. Granted, the people above the median have to help pay for what brings people up to the median, but that is what we'd like to see.
How does it perpetuate recurrent inequities? I didn't quite get that.
Well, current versus up. So I think when we look at from our perspective, and this is getting into a much larger kind of conversation, I was gonna try to sidestep
All right.
this time. But we look at, what Brigham did and pre-Brigham, when you wanted to increase offerings in your local school district, the solution was, let's grow our grant list. And I think that created a bit more of a collaborative environment where you were focused on grant list growth for the sake of boosting your educational opportunities in your district. Now, obviously that created problems because not everybody has the same ability, the propensity to grow their grant list. However, when you move to a system where, and so that needed to be remedied, but when you move to a system where, the housing in your viewshed doesn't mean new revenue directly for your school down the road, it kind of enables some of our most envious tendencies. The developer of that housing can't go, these are students for your new school and dollars for your school down the street. That was kind of the hook. And now these are students for your new school and dollars to be sent to Montpelier to be redistributed, to all the schools around the state. And so, we have a conversation about local control with statewide dollars routinely in this building. We don't have a conversation enough about local control of the development of statewide dollars. And when grantless growth becomes everyone's job, it kind of becomes no one's job, and I think that's kind of the concern.
We're gonna have to wrap
We could go
this
on and
up.
on and
This
on
is
and on
getting
and on.
there.
On and on.
Okay, and
Happy to.
I have negative reactions to being told I should move out of my house and I don't get income sensitivity. And that's just my personal issue, but
Madam Chair, I don't think I'm not saying,
I've sat in this building for at least 10 years and been told by people who are still in their prime earning years that the problem is that people like me who bought a house for $40,000 50 years ago should move out of it and into some kind of a senior living complex, which does not exist, so that young people can move into my house, which is my home. And I think that I'm seeing another person with gray hair.
I've had this discussion with Austin a couple
Yeah,
of times.
These are the people that built the businesses, that built this state, that have hung in there with property taxes and paid them before there was income sensitivity. And if there were a lot of housing, even a moderate amount of housing for people to realistically move into without having to relocate to the northeastern Canadian border, I would say it's a much more realistic discussion. But we don't have that housing, and we've done a great deal to build some, but it's all been subsidized housing. We have not found a way to build the housing that people in this state can afford to buy. Now, we could talk about raising wages, but every time we've had that discussion, we get significant pushback from businesses because then they have to raise prices and you get significant turnover. I don't think it is constructive to find a group of people to blame.
and I don't really clear that's not what I'm doing, and I'm offering a potential policy to help seniors handle property tax liability and stay in their home in terms of the deferred, or sweeten the deal for them if they can downsize. None of these things are saying you must. These are just opportunities for folks if that's what they choose to do. And so I just want to make clear, I'm not trying to force anyone to do anything. I'm trying to present options for folks
But
that they may or may not take.
putting off paying your property taxes is going into debt. Most of the Vermonters I know do not want to go into debt or leave their children with debt. They don't want to do that. We are a proud people. We pay our bills. The Vermonters, no matter how hard it is, pay their property taxes. It is rare that you find someone who doesn't. They may not eat well, but they pay their bills. And I think we need to respect that and not, it is not the fault of the, well, maybe it is because some of us pulled up the drawbridge behind us. It didn't allow the development that we needed to house our children. So we're trying to make up for that now, but I don't, it's not going to solve our problem to say if we could just move people. And by saying we're not going to help you with your property taxes, you are forcing people out of their homes.
And again, I'm not saying we're not gonna, like, I'm not saying we're not gonna help people with property taxes. I'm proposing additional other forms of help for people, because even with the existing tools for help, it's not adequate for everybody.
Not for everybody.
And so I think, I put out a menu of different tools. Some people might look at those tools and say, not for me. Some might look at them and say, that's it. Some people might love the deferral program. In other states do it and it has usage. Some people might say that is not for me, and that's fine. No one's forcing them to do it or not do it.
Okay.
But I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to scapegoat or blame any one group of people, and I don't think anything in my testimony suggested that.
It is a recurring theme in this building that we have people living in homes that are larger than their needs. And if they just moved out, we would have a lot more single family housing. It's in here, it's in economic development. It is a reoccurring theme. And it's there. My concern is that for most of those people, there is not a viable alternative. All right.
And yeah, and that's where the deferral meets that there's not a viable alternative. And the downsizing credit means that if the alternatives on the brink of viable, this can help push the economics so that it is viable, for example. So that's where we're trying to get these different tools.
Okay. And there would be an interest charge on that deferral.
But
Because
potentially,
somebody else would have to make up that tax revenue. So it's that somebody else is the other taxpayers. If I defer my taxes, same way we do it now, everybody else in the system is going to pay what I don't pay. And that was the tax department's testimony, that if we need to collect $1 million and I don't pay my $1,000, then the other 10 taxpayers are going to have to pay $100 more. If my math isn't that good at this hour. So that in the way it works, isn't that different? At least starting out as the present system, because somebody else has to pay that difference. And maybe when maybe when everybody is deferring, or it starts getting paid in, we will get more of an equilibrium. But it's no more of a fantasy as a time. than taxing the wealthy. Which is the other thing that's been suggested, or second homes, because they are perceived as the wealthy. I know a lot of very moderate income people that own a camp on like Carmi or Joe's Pond around here, or Woodbury Lake, that their grandfather or great grandfather built. They're not rich.
Those are exempted, would be exempt though, wouldn't they? When those people.
They are second homes, so they are
I think there was an exemption for camps.
For camps, yeah. But if we go to owning homes, not all of them are that. I mean, there's no simple answer here.
I understand and appreciate that, you're faced with many very difficult
And I
situations.
apologize for venting my frustration. I had this meltdown in economic development. But we need to find a solution that doesn't depend on having to move people that built this state out of their homes until they want to move out of their.
And yeah, and I think we need to build a lot more homes.
We do.
So I thank you, this committee, for the
So
work
go
you did on
talk to
that.
the market. The demand is there and the market is not answering.
And I think,
And that's the frustration. We have demand and the market is not responding. I think because it can't.
well, I think you folks have done, in CHIP, you did a good work towards moving assistance to the market answering. And I think that there's other things that we can do together. So thank you for your time. And as I said, in the business of offering tools and avenues, not forcing people down. And we're not trying to scapegoat anyone or the other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just,
Thanks.
it's a little more sense.